Let's see, here we go. Okay, well, welcome everyone to our 20th Workplace Ninja User Group Netherlands webinar. I still have to get used to the new name. We started these webinars due to the whole COVID-19 crisis, and we are doing this on regular time frame, so almost every 2 weeks. It's almost, this is the 20th webinar already. The webinar will be recorded and you can view it back on our YouTube channel. Today we have Thomas Maurer. Well, I think everyone knows who Thomas is, but he will introduce himself later on. Let's see what the next slide has for us. We want to thank our sponsors, of course. Even though we are doing virtual events, we do need the sponsors. So a big thanks to them. We are reachable on social media, so if you want to tweet something, please use the hashtag WPNinjasNL. That's our official hashtag. You can follow us. If you were following us on either social media channel, that's still valid because we renamed our WMUC channels to Workplace Ninjas. And if not, please follow us. We can use every follower, of course, and you will be kept up to date of what's cooking within our user group. The upcoming events is that, first of all, I think that's in 2 weeks, we have Patrick van der Born and Rick Steinman with a very interesting session about deploying Windows 10 multi-user using Azure DevOps, Terraform, and Packer. That will be interesting. The week after, we have the next live Ask Us Anything live recorded webinar hosted by Ronnie and Frans about all the announcements of Microsoft Ignite. Those are being announced at the moment, so expect some great news there. And after that, I think it's the week after already, I forgot to add the date. We have quite an interesting speaker, Dirk-Jan Mollema, about Azure Conditional Access Attackers and you. So that will be quite an interesting session. So if you want to know more about attacking Azure AD, what you can do with conditional access, etc. It's we really advise you to attend that meeting. So quite some interesting speakers coming up. If you want to speak at one of our events, we have a Sessionize page available. The link is in here. So if you want to speak, submit your session. We will contact you and see whether speaking at one of our events is a possibility. Even if you are not an experienced speaker, please reach out to us. We can either help you by doing a co-presentation or do some tests up front, but we really want you to present at our events as well. I'm going to hand over the presentation to Thomas. Thomas, are you ready?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay. You're welcome, and good luck.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for joining, and it's an honor and pleasure to speak at this user group meeting. I always enjoy like good technical user group meetings. So that's why I also agreed to do this, and it's always a lot of fun. I know a lot of you in the call, so it's going to be definitely interesting. For those who don't know me, my name is Thomas Maurer. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft, and often get asked, like, what are we cloud advocates doing? We are part of the Azure engineering team, and we are sitting actually in CNE, that's like commerce and ecosystems. We also have very close partnerships with the teams in Microsoft Learn and Docs and so on. And obviously, again, as I said, with our engineering counterparts. So what we are doing is we're going out, creating content, delivering content in terms of presentations. And when I speak about creating content, this can be documentation, this can be blogs, this can be videos, this can be different types of presentation, learn modules, all the good stuff you can consume. But also sometimes we obviously help, like writing a couple of scripts or tools which help our customers as well. Another big part of our job is actually to gather feedback. So if you have, we're always looking at like what is working for our customers, what is not working, how can we improve and make sure that like the different customer scenarios are going to be well. My focus is going to be about hybrid management, or hybrid cloud, if you will. I remember I did a lot of, like some of you might remember, I did a lot of work on the Hyper-V and Azure Stack side, and I still do. And now, obviously, with the announcements we have around Azure Arc, that is going to be definitely very, very interesting. And I'm going to cover that in today's session. So I'm going to talk about hybrid management. I'm not necessarily just about servers. I'm going to cover a little bit more, but I'm going to speak mostly about servers because I think that is a good example for everyone in this call to understand, okay, what we actually can do. But again, I will tell you that many, many times during this presentation, it's not just limited to servers, right? And another promise I want to make in this presentation is it's going to be a lot of demo. So I spend most of the time doing some demos. However, I have a couple of slides at the beginning to like explain a couple of things and outline a couple of things before we actually dive into the demo part and then the things. So I also know that after this meeting, we will soon have the Ignite keynote, so I don't want to keep it too long, but I want to give you time to ask some questions at the end. I will not see if I have any questions in the chat right now, so I will basically go out. Either someone interrupts me or I will just like spend some time at the end of this presentation.
Yeah, if there are any questions, Thomas, we will interrupt you if possible. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, sometimes it can be difficult because if I'm excited about a product or a service, I can speak very, very fast without a break. but you can definitely try. No, it's
okay.
fine. Absolutely.
We will try.
Absolutely. Again, feel free to ask these questions. It's absolutely good to know. So let's jump right in. And before I actually talk about Azure Arc, I want to quickly explain a little bit why we did this and what the idea behind it is. And you will see that there is a little bit more than just like, okay, we're just installing an agent or anything, right? So first of all, one thing we realized is that customer environments are getting increasingly complex, right? And this is probably not news to you. This is probably something you already know. But interesting is then why is this happening? Why are they getting more and more complex? So one thing we see is that IT or like IT admins and IT developers and need to manage and deploy hundreds, if not thousands, of apps. Right? I have a little bit of background noise, by the way. I don't know if someone is not muted. Okay. So again, hundreds, if not thousands of apps. And some of these applications are very modern applications, right? They're written in modern languages like .NET Core. They're deployed on PaaS services, containers, or even serverless. But then we also have that huge amount of traditional applications which are running inside virtual machines and in some cases even on physical servers, right? And those are not going away so fast, right? They will not just say, okay, in 2 years, all of these applications are modernized. They will stick with us for quite some time. And so we need to obviously take care of all these applications. On the other hand, we also see that like, a lot of customers have very diverse infrastructure, right? If you look at today, they probably have their own data centers. They have, they're using service providers. They have branch offices, factories, retail stores, different edge locations, and they have different types of hardware and IoT devices. So that is a pretty large set of infrastructure they need to also take care of. And then last but not least, multi-cloud, right? Even though this sometimes is like as a strategy decision, like companies to tell like, okay, we want to have a multi-cloud strategy, but often it's also just like kind of like by accident, like for example, a company decides to go with Microsoft Azure, which, by the way, is a fantastic choice, just if that was not clear enough, they might have already departments which are using other cloud providers, and they're maybe not just going to migrate everything over to Azure in the next couple of weeks or months or even years. They're probably going to still use that. And so you also need to take care of these management of other of services and servers and applications which are running at other service or cloud providers, right? So again, a lot of complexity obviously in that. And we want to try to address this. And what I'm showing you here is actually not a screenshot. It's actually a picture I took from Microsoft Ignite in 2019 when we still had local or like in-person events, right? And that was on the picture here. You can see that it's Jason Sanders. He's basically the engineering lead of all the Azure services. So he's directly under Scott Guthrie. And he had basically the second keynote after Satya, and he was speaking about Azure hybrid a lot. And I'm not going to go and tell you like, okay, look, is our hybrid story in that sense with all the products on this slide. I have a better slide for that, but I want to quote him, and I think that is a very important sentence he said. He said, hybrid is going to be an end state for many of our customers, and not just an in-between state until everything is moved to the cloud, right? And that is a very, very bold thing to say when you think about where Microsoft is marketing is going and say, okay, cloud, and can stop about cloud. We actually know that not everything can go into the cloud, right? There are reasons why people still have their on-premises environments and others and investments, right? They probably invested already in infrastructure, so they're not going to just move everything to the cloud, or they have data sovereignty reasons. Where they actually need to have the data within the country or even in their own data center, or they have, for example, network latency issues or network issues at all, or challenges, let's put it that way, where in some cases the latency to the specific Azure data center is just too high. And in that sense, it makes sense to run something on-prem. Also, when you, for example, have not reliable connectivity, right, where you like sometimes you don't want to risk losing connectivity, and then everything stands still. Like, for example, I'm just talking to a customer which runs a couple of different factories, and they want to obviously use Azure services. However, they don't want to rely on that connectivity. So what if, like, if the connectivity goes down, they can't really access anything, or the whole factory stands still. So that is something I want to mention. Another thing I want to mention is that hybrid for Azure is really built in, right? Hybrid is not something new we are doing. We have a lot of different services. If you think about management services with log analytics, with automation, our security suite, our identity stuff with Azure AD, and so on, they're already hybrid. There is already a hybrid offering for quite some time. And that is why we say, for example, Azure is hybrid by design. Another thing I want to say is also, and I think that is very important if you compare us to others, is we don't just have a single product which does hybrid, right? We see that different customers have different needs, and we want to give them different tools and services and solutions so they can address that. Why I'm saying that? Because often I get the question is now, like, is Azure Arc replacing now Azure Stack? And then the answer is very simple. No, it's like two different solutions, right, for different scenarios. So let me a little bit talk about our hybrid story. This is kind of like our hybrid, we call that the hybrid hero slide, where you get all the information in one place. So I usually start on the top of the slide, but this time I'm going on the bottom right. So one thing we offer, obviously, and we could speak just about days about our IoT offering and our IoT solutions. So obviously we have Azure IoT, which help all those, like connecting these edge solutions, right? So that is one thing. And again, not going to spend too much time today to speak about this because we actually talk about Azure Arc mostly, but this is part of our hybrid story. And in the middle, you can see Azure Stack. And this is basically where you can get our cloud-inspired infrastructure. And it's not just like one product anymore. Like many of you maybe remember when we launched Azure Stack, it was like one product. It's now a family or a portfolio of products and solutions with Azure Stack Edge, which allows you to run AI and machine learning at the edge as a first-party appliance. We have Azure Stack Hub, which is like the traditional or the original Azure Stack, which gives you basically these cloud-native capabilities in, for example, also disconnected scenarios, where you have your own instance of Azure Resource Manager and own portal. And then we have our latest GA announcement was around Azure Stack HCI, which is our hyper-converged infrastructure product, which is basically great for virtualization. And we offer solutions there for like very small 2-node clusters in like branch offices or factories, up to very large 16-node clusters with high performance or very large capacity. So those are actually all solutions we can offer, because some customers need some sort of infrastructure if they're running in a hybrid environment, right? These can be IoT devices, but also obviously if they need some virtualization or basically physical devices to actually run that on. And now on the left side, you see a pretty big chunk of what we are doing with Azure Arc, and that is bringing Azure services to any infrastructure. And what does that mean with any infrastructure? We heard from our customers that they love, for example, like products or Azure services like Azure SQL. So Azure SQL is a great product, and our customers say, hey, we would love to keep using it. It's a service, it's secure, I don't need to take care of updating and all of that. However, we have these scenarios where, as I said before, we can't really use the ones in Azure because your Azure region is too far away, or we are in a country and we have some compliance or data sovereignty challenges to put data outside of that country. So that is something where we said, okay, look, if you can't use the Azure service for some reason, we're running in Azure, we will bring that Azure service to you. And that is one thing we are doing with Azure Arc. And that means we don't want to couple that with, for example, let's say Azure Stack. In many cases, we want to just make sure that if you have invested into a VMware environment, that you still can run that, right? If you're running that at another cloud provider, and you still want to use Azure SQL running another cloud provider, you can do that as well, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, what that means, because it's a part of Azure Arc, but it's a pretty cool thing to do. The most time I will spend in this presentation is now about this line in the middle, and that is this is like one of the main parts of Azure Arc, is being a single control plane to connect resources, as you can see, outside of Azure to the Azure control plane, and then you can use Azure to manage that. So what do I mean by single control plane? Before we jump into the demo, this allows us then to manage on-premises, multi-cloud, and edge environments directly from Azure. So we can actually organize resources and govern them at scale. And when I talk about scale, you probably realize that if you worked with Azure in the early days, where it was still service management and not Azure Resource Manager, you probably know that at one point you really realized, oh God, it's hard to manage all these resources in the cloud, right? And that is where, for example, Azure Resource Manager came in to help us doing that management at scale. And so we can leverage Azure Resource Manager, and I will show you that in a bit, to manage all these resources. The other thing is actually adopting developer cloud practices to their on-premise environment. So we can actually go out and manage, for example, Kubernetes clusters, right? So we can go out and say, we want to deploy a specific application which runs on a Kubernetes cluster. That Kubernetes cluster, but is not necessarily running in Azure. So we want to go out and actually do that and deploy that on Kubernetes clusters which are running outside of Azure using a technology called GitOps. And I will show you that also today in the presentation. Then obviously, while we are connecting this, why not take advantage of this Azure security offering and implement that as well for the resources which are outside of Azure? But enough talk on slides. Now let me show you a couple of demos here. Actually, how that actually looks like, what I just told you. So first of all, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Azure portal. I'm now in the all resources page. And what you can see here, everything in Azure here is a object or a resource. So we have, obviously, it has a name. Usually it has a type. It's part of a resource group. It's usually deployed in a location, and it's part of a subscription, right? And then you can also obviously use tagging to organize these resources. Now, again, wouldn't it be great if I would not just see Azure resources in here, but also resources which are outside of Azure? And that is exactly what we're doing with Azure Arc. So let me quickly go here and say, hey, make that a little bit easier. And let's just show me all my servers which are running outside of Azure, which I connected already using Azure Arc. And then side by side, I want to see my virtual machines or servers which are running in Azure. So if I do that, now I just see everything, all my servers side by side, right? Doesn't matter where they're running. I can see here my Azure VMs as well as my servers running Azure Arc. And these can be physical servers, can be virtual machines running on premises or at other cloud providers. It can be Windows or Linux, doesn't really matter, right? I just see everything here side by side. And you can see here that these Azure Arc machines are basically also joined. They also have a type. They also are part of a resource group. They're also part or connected to a location, and they're also part of a subscription. So they really are a Azure resource. And that is the difference from like the existing stuff we had, for example, when we talked about hybrid, right? We realized to make it real hybrid scenario where we could really leverage the power of Azure, we needed to make these resources outside of Azure a hybrid resource. So what I can now also do is I can, for example, go out and use tags, for example, to filter. So I have here, let's say I want to see all my servers for a specific cost center. Doesn't matter, again, if they're running in Azure or wherever. I just want to see all the servers. So I can just go out and use that tag. And you can see here now, I've listed, like, there's one Azure VM as well with one server running outside of Azure, and they both belong to that cost center, right? So that is one thing. And this really helps us to get that overview and organize these resources and show them in a single place. Now, that you believe me, that this is actually not just like something which shows up in the UI, in the portal. I quickly want to show you the Azure Resource Graph Explorer, which helps us, for example, to list different servers here. So what I have here, I have a query which basically lists all the resources which are Microsoft.hybrid compute machines. These are basically the Azure Arc enabled servers. So if I run that query, you can see here now, again, I get all these machines back. And again, they look like Azure resources. Now, obviously, in some cases, I want to read them side by side. So I have a very simple query again here. And that's, if I run this, I get the same thing I just showed you in the portal, but just as a code here, basically back as a result. My Azure compute machines, you can see here the Microsoft Compute virtual machines, as well as my Microsoft Hybrid Compute machines directly here. So you trust me now that these are Azure resources, but you also want to do something with that. What does that actually enable? So if you are familiar with Azure policy, I want to show you one scenario for Azure Arc machines. You're probably aware of Azure policy. It allows us to lock down an Azure environment and say, hey, for example, we don't want every developer in my company to deploy, for example, to all the Azure regions worldwide. We probably want to lock it down to some of the regions. We probably don't want every developer or IT administrator to deploy the largest MV2 series machines with like a couple of hundred cores, I think a couple terabytes of memory, and they drain your credit card in like 3 seconds. We want to lock that down. That is one thing, use of Azure policy. We also have Azure policy guest configuration, and that allows us to audit the operating systems of Azure VMs. And with Azure Arc now, we can extend that to, for example, servers which are running outside of Azure. So let me show you an example here. I would go and basically create a new assignment. So I'm going to do that with a new initiative. An initiative is basically just a collection of different policies. I would select the scope of where I want to deploy that policy. And then I can go in here, and what you can see here, if I go to built-in, we already provide you with a couple of built-in ones. Some of them are like technical ones, right, as you can see, but some of them are like industry certification ones, which do not just like do the Azure environment, but also the operating systems and audit that. And so, for example, I have one for IRS, I have UK official, UK NHS, I have PCI, ISO, and so this then basically audits these environments. We're not saying that like if everything is green, for example, you're then ISO compliant, but we help you to find the issues basically where you're red with that. Now, in my case, I want to use a very simple one. I want to actually audit my machines, all my servers, to find insecure password settings, right, on my servers. Doesn't matter, again, if it's Linux or Windows. So I would select that, and I could add some like assignment name and a description, but usually they come with some parameters. This one comes only with one, and it says, hey, do you want to assign this now also to Azure Arc connected servers? And I could say yes, true. And then if we go through that, it would then also not just assign these policies to Azure VMs, but also to Arc enabled servers. Again, this would take a while until I actually get the states ready. So what I want to do is, like in a good cooking show, I already prepared that. And so if I go to compliance view, you can see a couple of different things. The first thing you can see, I don't do a great job when it comes to compliance in my environment, right? I can see here there's a lot of like policies I'm not compliant, but then also luckily I have a couple of them where I am actually compliant. So I already promised you I deployed that password policy here to audit for insecure password settings. So you can see here I'm not compliant. And again, it also tells me with what I'm not compliant and how I can basically go ahead and change that. But more interestingly, I also want to see which servers or which machines are actually not compliant. And here, if I zoom in again, you can see here that this is not just for Azure VMs, but also for our Microsoft hybrid compute machines as well. So I can see now even my on-prem machines or servers which are not compliant with these policies. And again, you can build your own policies as well. So you basically, if you're looking at finding a way of, for example, replacing group policy for your servers, this is an absolutely great way. We even offer you some tools to actually convert group policies basically to Azure policy guest configurations. Now, one thing I have to mention though, currently we're just auditing these machines right now, right? We cannot set values, but as the team said, we're working on that. So that is the first thing I want to show you, and I want to show you now how we actually done this. So we talked now about the Azure control plane, and this is a very high level view of how that looks like. And when we start on the left, we can see here, we as Azure customers, we use tools like the portal, PowerShell, CLI, Bash script, APIs, and so on to interact with Azure. And when we are interacting with Azure, we are actually interacting with the Azure Resource Manager. And that one is doing all the magic behind the scenes when it comes to role-based access control, logs, descriptions, policies, blueprints, search, indexing, groups, tags, and so on. And it also offers you, obviously, as most of you will probably know, about like templates to deploy things for infrastructure as code. And then on top of that, we offer a couple of management services for monitoring, update management, containers, backup, and security. And before we announced Azure Arc, the Azure Resource Manager actually only managed Azure resources, right? But what we did with Azure Arc, or what Azure Arc does as a control plane, is actually connecting resources outside of Azure to the Azure Resource Manager. So it's basically the bridge between these resources which are outside of Azure. Again, these can be servers, as I showed you, as I will show you many times. It can also today be Kubernetes clusters or data services. Actually, we should even add more. We can also not just add data services, we can also add existing Microsoft SQL servers and Azure Stack HCI, which already has the Azure Arc enabled agent included. So that is basically how we do it. And how we actually connect it is by using an agent on these resources to actually publish it into Azure, right? Again, we don't want to build any dependencies of your resources with Azure. So I get often the question, what happens if internet connectivity goes down or Azure is not available for some reason? Doesn't mean my local workloads go down. And the answer is no. Your local workloads still keep running. You can even use your local tools to manage these. So if you have some server admin tools, your Kubernetes tools, or use Azure Data Studio to manage your databases, you can still keep using those, right? I think that is a very important part of the whole process. Now, how do I actually do that? What do I gain? So if you want to onboard servers or other resources to Azure Arc, like Kubernetes cluster, what you would do is actually you would just go to the Azure portal and you go to Azure Arc. And then you go to something I call the Azure Arc Center, if you will, where actually you get all the information about Azure Arc in one place. And you can see here you have the Getting Started guide, which explains you how to add, for example, existing infrastructure like servers and Kubernetes clusters. You can go out and deploy Azure data services like Azure SQL, for example, outside of that. And then you can also just view all the Azure resources here I have added already. So I can see here on the left side, you can see here I can manage servers, Kubernetes clusters, existing SQL servers, Azure Stack HCI, and then on the services, I can see here data controllers. That is actually the thing which allows me to deploy Azure SQL outside of Azure. If I go back to the overview, I want to quickly highlight also another thing is like the pricing. I often get asked about this, and since I'm here already, I'm quickly going to talk about that. So if you want to use Azure Arc, Azure Arc for servers has a base set of functionality. So if you just connect your server to Azure, and then you use, for example, tags or the resource graph or role-based access control, this will be free. And then you have some paid services here, which extend this. For example, for Azure Guest Configuration Policy, you will be charged there on a monthly basis for all the service you manage. But then we also have, for example, some additional resources for Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. The Kubernetes part as well. This is, by the way, because it's Ignite. It was in preview until yesterday, I guess. Now it's GA. As it looks like. And so you also start paying for this for certain prices, depending on where you run it. And then we have the data services part, which is basically currently in preview, and there are no additional costs through that, right? So how do I actually onboard a system to Azure Arc? So it's very, very simple. I can go here to add service with Azure Arc. I could then I basically get two options to generate the script. These are basically just wizards which help you to generate that script you can run. You could also just go to the docs and run that by yourself. One thing is to add a single server. In that sense, it generates your script, which will prompt you for your Azure credentials. So you get a device logging for the first time to register that specific server. However, if you obviously have multiple servers, like hundreds of servers you want to onboard, it's not very handy to log in on each of those. So what you can do is we can create a service principal, which allows you to just run that. And that only has permissions to onboard new servers, right? There's no additional permissions, only onboards new servers. So you can actually use that in your automation script to onboard all of that. So for the sake, I want to quickly show you how that is built so you can also see what are the requirements. As I said, this will actually need an agent. So this script will download the agent, will install the agent, and will then connect that agent to Azure. So for that, we need outbound HTTP access to Azure, some of the Azure APIs. Again, this is only going to be port 443. Again, and also to some specific Azure Arc APIs, which you can find in the documentation. I will also need some local admin rights to actually install that agent, very obvious. And then I need a resource group I can actually add these servers to. So now the wizard helps me here. I can select the subscription. I can select the resource group here, which I already prepared. I can select a region. This should just be the closest region of your server. That's where the agent connects to and sends the metadata to. However, it does not obviously transmit any user data in that sense to that region. It's it's just for the agent connectivity. In my case, Western Europe is currently the one I want to use. And then I would obviously select if it's a Windows server I want to add or a Linux server. Depending on that, I would obviously get different scripts and different agents. Like on the Windows side, I get a PowerShell script and an MSI file. And on the Linux side, it will be a shell script. I can also configure a proxy if I run behind a proxy. And then I can add some tags. And we already provide you with a default set of tags you can set. It's exactly the same thing as the tags you would use for Azure resources. So you can also use your custom tags. However, you can also assign these later on manually or using Azure Policy. And then at the end, you get that script. You can see here that's the script to actually onboard that resource. As I said, it downloads the package, it installs the package, and then it runs the registration for that specific server. So what I quickly want to do is, and that's always when you're great prepared like I am, I want to quickly show you how that actually looks like as soon as it's installed on a server. Let me see if that works. If not, no worries. It's not that big of a deal. Passwords are difficult. So here I am on one of these servers. This is my app 01. That's the one you probably saw in the presentation already. So what I have here is I have a process running. I think it's, sorry. So it's this process, which is actually when I installed the agent that is running in the background, that is actually from the Azure Connected Machine agent, as we call it. That's basically the Azure Arc agent, which runs there. I also get then a command line tool, which will help me to do certain stuff. So if I hit that, for example, you can see here I can connect, disconnect, help, logs, and so on, get some additional information. If I do, for example, a show command, it will provide me with some additional information. So you can see here what the resource name in Azure is now for that server. Again, just to be clear to everyone, this one is running on premises in my own data center. My own data center means basically underneath my desk here. But you see here it's connected like an Azure resource. It belongs to a resource group. It belongs to a subscription, to a tenant. It even gets a VM ID, and I will speak about that in just a bit. And then you get some other information about if that is running. And you can see here that this is not running on an Azure VM. For some demo environments, we can also set this up in Azure just to show people how it works. What I want to talk about is this Azure ID. So this server now gets a managed identity from Azure, right? So I could now use different tools or like if I have an application, it can already be use this managed identity to log into Azure resources or applications using that identity, which is pretty handy if you run that. And again, as soon as I would remove it from Azure Arc, that local server doesn't get a managed identity. So even though you're probably not using the management thing, one thing we see a lot of customers doing is probably just taking advantage of the managed identity. So that is pretty cool. Now, what can I do else can I do when the server is now connected? You can see here is my app 01. That's the one I just showed you. And then I have here another server I want to show you. And the first thing you can see here is it looks like an Azure resource, right? It is really connected. It has tags. You can see here it belongs to a resource group and a subscription. And you can see here on the right side, you get some local information on the system itself, like the computer name, the full qualified domain name, you get which operating system is running, and so on. All this local information here. On the right side, you can see here, as I said, it looks like an Azure resource. So I can have things like the activity log or role-based access control. So that is actually very important because for many Azure hybrid services in the past, we could onboard them, for example, to Azure Update Management or to Log Analytics. However, there was not a real way of doing like role-based access control if you had like different servers. So if I would want to have only the SharePoint admins seeing the SharePoint servers, that was in some cases very limited. Now with Azure Arc, onboarding these servers as an Azure resource, we get the full access control here, which is very important. We can then use, for example, make quick use of security. So I can use Security Center to get recommendations for that server. I can also take advantage of extensions, which you're probably familiar with from VM extensions. So I have a couple already deployed. So I can now leverage that also for on-prem resources. So I could go out and deploy the custom script extension for that Windows server. Could use PowerShell desired state configuration. I could use log analytics and much, much more. Going word down, I obviously can then, like if I deploy the log analytics agent, I can then actually run queries. And here again, the role-based access control here is key. Before that, I had to give people access to the log analytics workspace, and they could basically see all the logs in that workspace. And now I only see the logs for that specific machine. So I can run here to get some performance log data here, for example. So you can see here, I get that here, but just for that single server. I can also look at Azure monitoring. I can enable that as well. So what I can get here is like the usual performance monitoring where I see like disk utilization, CPU utilization, memory, and so on to get all that stuff here. I can also get like dependency agent on that machine. So I see all the dependent connectivities. So for example, here's my server and it connects to a couple of different servers on different ports. I would not call them servers necessarily. Those like I would call them a better word. I think it would be endpoint. So if I drill into this one, you could see here, these are like the endpoints that server connects to on this specific port. And you can see here, for example, zoom in, this is, for example, one of the Azure Arc endpoints that server connects to because of the Azure Arc agent. But you can obviously also see that for local ports as well, like for the Active Directory or DNS connection as well. You also get change tracking. So what you see here, I can see like the change tracking we all know already from Azure. This is not really different, but now I can actually use that with role-based access control to just see the change tracking on that specific server. You can see here all the changes happening. If I go to inventory, I can see all the software inventory on that server. So I can go out and say, like, see if that has Edge installed, and you can see here that server has Edge installed. You can also see that with services and so on. I can also use update management. So here, for example, I see that I have a couple of updates open, which are not installed yet. As you can see here, since those are not necessary updates, the compliance state is still green. But if there would be an update, a security update or something, which is not in preview, I would obviously recognize that. Now, to install these updates, I quickly go to Schedule Update Deployment. Again, this uses Azure Update Management, as we know before, but now I have to like the possibility to just do that for that specific server. So if I'm the server admin just for that server, I can actually go out and manage that by myself. So in this case, I will just provide that the name, that deployment. It recognizes that this is a Windows server, so I'm automatically selected Windows. I have a maintenance window I can configure. I can also say what to do. I could say reboot if required, which usually sounds like a good option. And then I can go out and say I could either update now, that would kick off the update in like 5 to 10 minutes, or I could say, because I'm doing a presentation right now and I don't want to reboot that server, and maybe some customers would say, okay, probably I don't want to do that during work hours. We can go and schedule that. And we could even make it a recurring task here, or which we actually can go out and say, okay, to do that every Tuesday, for example, at 10 p.m. or something like that. I can also then go out which classifiers, update classification should be installed. I can include and exclude different updates, run pre and post scripts, and then I basically would just fire that and say, okay, that's great. Now, just for those who haven't really seen update management before, it's obviously not very handy if I want to update a group of servers. I don't want to do that per server in that sense. So I could go here and click on manage multiple multiple machines. In that sense, I will automatically be taken to the automation account with the update management solution. And now here you can see all my servers, which are automatically added to that. Doesn't matter if they're non-Azure VMs, which are joined using Azure Arc. Those can be also Azure VMs, and you can see here the compliance state. And here you could then also schedule an update deployment for a group of servers, right? Again, Windows and Linux, obviously, physical and virtual, wherever they are running, basically. So that is pretty cool. I think a very great feature. I also quickly want to show you something more. And here is the policy view. I showed you the policy which I had as an overall policy administrator. Now, in this sense, I only see the policies which are assigned to that specific server. And you can see here I'm actually green for most of it, except for, again, the password settings. So I could see as a server administrator, I can now see that someone assigned that policy to my server and I'm not compliant with it. So I should probably go out and fix that, right? Good. Let me quickly show you one more thing. I have like one more thing which I quickly want to show you. So one other thing we have here in Azure Arc, I showed you the server management. We also can do the same thing with Kubernetes clusters, right? So I have a Kubernetes cluster here. I really hope it's loading because it looks like we are updating to GA. Oh, here we go. And I have my Kubernetes cluster here. And again, it looks exactly kind of like the same way as I did show you with servers. But so I get monitoring, I get the role-based access control and so on. But something I want to show, and not even policy, but something I want to show you is GitOps, right? So think about it. I want to deploy an application, a containerized application on top of that Kubernetes cluster. And I want to keep that application up to date. I need to have some sort of tooling to do that, right? And so what I did here is I used that GitOps technology, put it in here. And so my application here is stored in this Git repo. And I configured it that the cluster itself goes and pulls that application for changes every 3 seconds, right? Probably not the thing you want to do in production, but better for a demo. So the application currently looks like this. And you can see here, I probably want to change that application right now. Now I'm going to do something which, please don't do that at home. This is really me being the admin from hell. And I'm actually going in and going to change that file. So in that file, we have here the Hello Azure monitoring community. That's the message. I want to fix that. So I'm directly going into changing that file. So I'm not going to do any commit to a nice branch. I'm really just going to directly into the main branch and say, hello, friends. But I still do a commit message, right? So I can say, hello, friends. And now you can see I'm directly doing that into the main or master branch and commit that change without any approval steps, without anything. So please don't do that at home. And what happens now is with that configuration I just showed you, it will go out that at one point, the Azure Arc agent running on that Kubernetes cluster will go out and pull that and see that there is a change and then get that change down of that application. And now that was a very small change to the application, but even if it's a larger change, which has a little bit more to it, I would then go out and it would pull that down and would also configure the application. Now, if I go here and if I talked long enough, you can see here the application is now changed to hello friends. Now, you probably say, Thomas, well, you can also, like for that cluster, why don't you do that directly, right? Yes, absolutely. But imagine if you have, like, let's say 10 or 20 or hundreds of Kubernetes clusters deployed with that application, and you want to go out and update these applications on top of these Kubernetes clusters, you can directly do that very, very easily directly from here. So let's go back to the slides. I want to show you a couple of key takeaways here. The first one, obviously, which we can do for Azure Arc enabled servers, but also for Kubernetes clusters, is inventory. So we can do inventory of Windows and Linux servers from physical to virtual machines running in private data centers or in other cloud providers, completely domain agnostic. I can do governance and security. So I get these policies, which I used for my Azure VMs, but I can now also use them for my Azure Arc enabled servers. I can onboard like security centers and I get a compliance view of these machines. I get role-based access, which is very, very handy. Obviously, I showed you that, like you can give access to the owner of that specific workload or application. If I'm an MSP, like a managed service provider, and I use Azure Lighthouse, Azure Arc will also natively integrate into that. And then I can also then just manage these resources at scale in terms of like get a searchable inventory. I can use tags to organize these resources. And I can see that in the portal, but I can also use the CLIs or Azure Resource Graph Explorer to find these resources, the things I just showed you very early on in the presentation. Now, again, I mentioned here a couple of things. It's about like organizing and govern Kubernetes clusters and servers to make sure that they're configured in the right way. The app deployment I just showed you at the end, where you can do app management at scale on your Kubernetes clusters using GitOps. And then the last thing I didn't really show you, but I talked about it, it's actually the possibility to deploy, for example, Azure SQL managed instances on top of like the customer's infrastructure, or if they run it in another cloud provider. I'm going to talk a little bit how that looks like. So since I have a technical audience here, I also quickly want to show a high-level architecture, how that looks like. And again, it's pretty much the same I showed a little bit before with some more detail. So the light blue you can see is all Azure Arc related technology. So, excuse me. So if you're working against Azure Resource Manager, we use the portal, CLI, APIs, and so on. We have the Azure Resource Manager providing us with identity, RBAC, policies, and so on. What we call, then there is this thing, what we call resource providers. And so Azure Arc, the different components of Azure Arc have different resource providers. For example, for Azure Arc enabled servers, Kubernetes clusters, and data services. And on the bottom, you can see here the Azure Arc agent on the server. Again, Linux or Windows can connect to that resource provider, and that's where you do the management. In the middle, you can see a Kubernetes cluster that also has an agent, and it connects to the resource provider in Azure. And then on top, you find something really interesting. That's the resource provider and the agent for the Azure Arc data services, again, which allows you to run Azure SQL managed instances and Postgres right now in preview. And what you can see here is that to make this work, we have something which we deploy. It's called Azure Arc Data Controller. And this one is running on top of a Kubernetes cluster. So it's a containerized solution. So what you need to actually run these data services in your data center, you just need a Kubernetes cluster. It doesn't need to be AKS on Azure Stack HCI or anything. It can be really any type of Kubernetes cluster. Obviously, we have some version restrictions, but other than that, it doesn't matter if it's like OpenShift or vanilla version of Kubernetes as well. And you can still use your local tools to manage. So doing another step back, quick overview about our hybrid scenario. Again, The Azure Arc is not just our one hybrid product or our hybrid solution. We have a ton of other things, like, for example, as I mentioned, Azure IoT, our Azure Stack portfolio, and all the other services which come together. So depending on what the customer needs are, we are providing the customer with the right tooling. And you can obviously even combine these. So it doesn't mean that you either need Azure Stack versus Azure Arc or Azure. It's really just bringing everything together. That is the most important part here. So with that, I talked a lot. I want to quickly see if I have any questions, or just feel free to speak up within the chat.
We haven't seen any questions popping up, Thomas. So, I think everybody is also eagerly awaiting for the keynote, which will start soon, probably.
Yep.
So, hey, let me take over the presentation and do some final closing slides. Wait a moment. First of all, Thomas, thank you for taking the time to present for our user group. We, of course, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
As said, we recorded the session, and if you are willing to share your slides with us, we will publish them as well.
Yep.
We will probably do that a little bit later this week. So in 2 weeks, as already mentioned, we have the next WP Ninjas webinar with Patrick van der Born and Rick Steinman. Once again, thanks to our sponsors. And for the people who attended, thank you for attending our meeting. And have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks all.
Thanks, Thomas.